Before we dive in, support the Middle Ground Mike on Patreon for just $1.50 a month. Get early, exclusive access to content and help us keep finding the middle. Tragedy, tension, turmoil, but in the middle of it all, is there still space for the truth? This is Middle Ground Mike, and today we are threading the needle between America's most divisive stories, from Fort Stewart to Tehran, from Austin to DC, to ask a simple, hard question: can the center still hold? Let's start with one of the bigger topics. Something that's terribly tragic. Multiple soldiers were shot at Fort Stewart in Georgia. A place meant for preparation, not chaos. It's raised a lot of questions about mental health in the military. Some people talked about gun control within the armed forces. Gun control is a really tough subject, especially in the armed forces. I think it's definitely in my opinion, more of a mental health issue that we need to definitely recognize and push. And what is the readiness for our own domestic systems to prepare for this? Where's the middle ground on this? We support our troops well, we also kind of recognize the urgent need for systemic care, not just in war zones, but at home, right? They go through some traumatic things. A lot of them do. And even sometimes some of the basic stuff can be hard for some people. So, it's something that we definitely got to look at, and our sympathies go out to everybody. Nobody deserves to get shot, especially when you're standing up for your own country. It's awful. Let's talk a little bit here about Israel, Gaza, and Iran. Essentially, like, it's one gargantuan-sized powder keg that seems like it's ready to explode, but then it kind of dies down, but then it spikes up. The conflict in Gaza has escalated again, but, I know recently there was some attacks that killed some aid workers and things of that nature, and that's not okay. Israel's got to do better on that, but at this time, the backdrop is darker, right? Iran's direct involvement is now growing. The retaliation to the bombings, to the cyber attacks. And what are we going to do about it? We're caught between backing Israel and pressuring Iran and trying to manage some form of diplomacy. At some point, we're just going to have to be like, hey, this is what it is. Because obviously this is just not working at our current approach. Well, here and at the middle ground, we ask, is unconditional support to one side a strategy or political reflex? Where's the room for peace, security, and human rights, right? So aid workers that are supposed to help divvy out food, and even I believe Israel even said they didn't. I mean, obviously I don't think they meant to kill them, but that's a big part of the problem, right? I know the bombings have continued and continued and continued, and there's a lot of talk out there about this war still being pushed because of Benjamin Netanyahu's. I believe if he gets out of office, he's going to be prosecuted, because I believe there is some audio tapes of him taking bribes. I don't know the full details behind that, but that has been talked about frequently, that is the reason he is still pushing this. I do not know the internal intricacies of Israeli politics, so I will not claim to know that. I just know that it's something that is heavily talked about, but when it comes to Iran, right? Iran's retaliating, now they're going to start doing more things to kind of, not that they already weren't, but they're going to kind of try to make our life even more difficult. Even if they say they aren't going to publicly, I have no doubts that they will privately. That is the nature of things, how things go, right? So, we got to do better with that. We got to find some kind of way to get Israel to back off. Let's help Gaza rebuild, let's put them in charge of their own rebuild, but let's get them some supplies, and I'm not talking weapons, I'm talking materials, right? To rebuild their things. Let's help them. We don't need to be killing any more of these people. I mean, it's senseless at this point. When it first happened, I think that Israel had every right to retaliate, just like any nation would. But now you're just kind of like taking a nuclear bomb to a fly because you've destroyed so much there. And that's not personal towards Israel in any certain way. It wouldn't matter if it was Israel or if it was a European country doing this. You're not really fixing anything, you're making it worse. You're creating future problems down the road. These kids are going to remember what you've done. They're going to remember seeing their parents getting killed, whether they were in Hamas or not. And they're going to remember that. They're going to remember the trauma of starving, and they're going to have one point place to blame. And it will end up being Israel. I'm not saying that we shouldn't go after bad guys or nothing like that. No, but we got to be conscious of what our actions are going to do down the road, and it will create more problems for us. Not I mean, not for just America, but for Israel. I mean, mainly Israel, right? Because they're neighbors. So it's something that we need to really, 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 really take a good hard look at, right? I know sometimes things can't be avoided, but it just seems like with where things are going now, we're creating more problems 10, 20 years down the road. It's going to, I mean, you're going to have a bunch of people that's all they're going to remember. And when somebody just remembers something like that about their family, all it is just going to be pure rage. There's nothing you're going to tell them to make it any better. Thoughts go out to people in the Middle East. Do what you can to stay afloat. Push forward. Just keep pushing forward. All right, let's talk a little bit about the Trump talking about putting another round of sanctions on Russia. From my understanding is, they did issue some new sanctions, kind of targeting like defense, tech, and I believe even more financial areas, you know, but kind of like what I was thinking, have the sanctions become political theater more than policy? Because they keep seeming to find ways around them. I believe Trump just slapped another 25% tariff on India for them buying Russian's oil and kind of propping them up per se. Yeah, I don't know if I'd have went that far, but I definitely see his point behind it. Now, I don't disagree with doing something about it. I just don't know if I would have went that far. That seems a little extreme. And if we want to have a real effect on the war machine in Russia, we got to be unified, not doing this like partisan posturing and just, kind of like pounding the chest. Oh, we're the ones that are right. No, we need to be unified on this Russia thing. Like, we need to end this war. Again, it's another war where people are just dying for no reason, except for, the Ukraine's holding its own, but, it's kind of time to end this thing and figure out a way to get to peace. That's the most important part, is finding a way to get to peace. I believe either this week or next week, I was reading that Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, is going to be, I believe him and Trump are going to be meeting face to face. I don't know if Putin is coming here or not. I would assume that he's probably coming here, and hopefully a face-to-face meeting can really kind of help get the ball rolling, because Donald Trump has kind of called Putin out a little bit recently, and recent weeks over, pretty much saying, "Hey, you pretty much lied to us. You're not doing ABC," which he's not wrong. Hopefully those talks with Putin this week can bear some fruit. We can start moving in the right direction, and with how things might go economically, depending where you're at, we could use a little piece to kind of even things out. Let's move on and talk about one of the other big things going on right now. The Democrats in Texas walk out again. It's political theater. I get why they do it, because they're worried about gerrymandering, this, that, and the other thing, and they're trying to block the Republican-backed bills, right? I get it, and I get why you want to avoid the gerrymandering, but this is my problem with the whole thing, right? They're throwing this huge fit, but if they were the ones that were in control, they'd be doing the same exact thing. That's the problem. That's why we don't get nothing done here, because of stunts like this, right? Because rather than rather than get on the floor, make a big stink, just get it out there in the media, walk the streets and talk to people talking about it, if that's how you feel about it. But just doing that, it's theater. I believe it was in Texas. They did it, I don't know, however many years ago then, and it didn't work then. It doesn't solve problems. All it does is create more division. It does not solve problems. You need to meet these things head on, get your citizens involved, and, walk up to the capitals or wherever they, and be like, hey, we're not the capitals, but walk to, I don't know if they're holding like a rally somewhere, their local representative, right? Bring it, talk to them, do these things, send emails, like whatever it takes. That's the whole point of our system, is to be able to do these things. We need to do a better job. Kind of like our overall view here is effective opposition really needs to engage it. They don't need to retreat. They need to fight the bills with the people's voice behind them, and not empty chairs, because like I said, you don't get nothing done if you're not participating. Michael Jordan even said it best, you miss 100% of the shots that you don't take. So I really hope that they can get that part figured out. I think it's just going to kind of be one of those things because the GOP is the majority down there, that it will be what it is. That's just my opinion. I don't know that for a fact. It has not been finalized yet. Um, let's talk a little bit about green card to deportation pipeline. This one really kind of got me a little bit. The story isn't going to get better with time. It's not going to get enough airtime. Immigrants applying for green cards now may actually be placed in removal proceedings if their application is denied. The act of applying for legal status, I get that if it's denied, but that act can now get you deported too. So, I get that, hey, if you're denied, for your green card status, you get kicked out, right? But, is efficiency, there's got to be a path that's firm but fair. But we got to have enforcement and dignity, not just because it's, these poor people. No, we got to have dignity in our own actions and our own conscience. I don't know if, I don't know if that's the right way to do it. I think it should just kind of been left how it was. They just enforced the law that was there, but that's more of my opinion. So let's move on to Democrats' Project 2029. We haven't talked about it for a while, and their 2028 possible frontrunners. Let's talk about the future a little bit. Project 2029 for the Democrats. It's their whole long-term strategy. They want to reshape things, policy, courts, elections, pass a Congress, but who's the face of the party in 2028? Because, you got this big thing in the party kind of polling both sides. You got the AOCs of the world, and then you got the John Fettermans of the world, right? Right now there's no clear front runner that dominates the polls. Gavin Newsom, Gretchen Whitmer, and even AOC swirl and the speculation storm. And this is not a dig at AOC because I respect her passion. There's not really dirt on AOC. She is who she is, and you got to respect that. But I just don't know if her views would get enough of a majority to get Democrats to where they want to go. Some of her views aren't going to resonate with a lot of America, and I get where she's come from, because in principle, a lot of the time she's right in some of her issues that she brings up, right? We just disagree on how to make it happen. But yeah, she's definitely one of the cleaner conscience people out there. I just don't know if her policies would be electable on a national level, especially if we consider Kamala Harris extremist. You ain't seen nothing yet till you got AOC.
Let's take a quick break.
Quick break. If you love what you're hearing, head to patreon.com/middlegroundmike. Just $1.50 unlocks bonus content and keeps us going strong for years to come. The polls show a huge shift, right? Especially in independents and moderates. Independents and moderates are really getting to a point where they're just going to be completely and utterly done with extremes. Where's the middle on this, right? Democrats need a bold, but they got to have a balanced voice. You can't just be one way. You need someone that appeals to everyday Americans without putting them down because they don't think the way that you do. And stop putting people down who didn't, quote unquote, go to college and get a real job, or however you want to word it, right? That puts working class people, why would they vote for you if you're going to talk to them like, why should someone vote for you if you're going to talk to them like that? Like, make it make sense. Make it make sense, because you turn on the news and every uneducated voters, they say these things, right? When they're talking about it, they'll say uneducated voter votes for Republicans. And then somebody chimes in talking about, oh yeah, if you're an uneducated, this race or that gender, you vote Republican. So you're essentially calling some people stupid without saying stupid, and then wondering why they're not voting for you. I mean, a little tact would go a long way in that situation. Probably would have helped you win the White House in all reality. Outside of Kamala saying she wouldn't change anything, I mean, that definitely resonated with a lot of Americans. But, the Democratic Party faces, they're facing a tough choice, right? Are they going to double down on progressive populism or reclaim, the moderate area that Clinton and Obama seemed to dominate? Obviously, a lot more Clinton than Obama. Obama had a lot more liberal policies. Yeah, but the question you have is the base Democratic Party, would they accept the centrist? Somebody leans, would they accept John Fetterman type or, like a Clinton type to run for national office again? I don't know. I would hope so. You would think that everybody would want to have a voice of reason in the room, but you don't know. these are the questions that we're going to be tracking, and kind of seeing where that goes. Obviously we're going to do the same thing with the GOP as 2026 and 2028 come around. You know, um, and let's talk about 2028 a little bit. Do Republicans have a middle ground candidate? Can JD Vance be that bridge between MAGA and the other part of the GOP? Can he keep that same momentum, right? A lot of it's going to depend on how things go in the next couple of years, but also, I mean, can he be that guy? A lot of people talk about like Nikki Haley and Tim Scott. I'm sorry, but to me, they're just not centrist. They're not. All they are is war hawks that pound their chest. My opinion, not knocking them as individuals, but that to me seems to be their stances more than anything. It will be very hard to break out of MAGA dominance, right? But that's why you've got to find a way to connect both. Because in a lot of ways, they do have a lot of similar things in common. It's just not put in the right manner. There's nobody willing to come to the table to compromise, to go, okay, hey, because together, everybody's stronger, no matter which party it is. Again, I don't see Nikki Haley or Tim Scott really going anywhere in terms of presidential aspirations, but I could be wrong, right? Everybody didn't think Donald Trump could win in 2016, and then he did. But Nikki Haley is definitely a war hawk, and Americans have rejected that the last two elections. They generally have started to go away from pro-war candidates. So that's just kind of what it is, right? So let's talk about another candidate for the U.S. Senate out of Kentucky, Nate Morris. He's an entrepreneur. He's GOP, but a lot of people are talking he could be the next J.D. Vance, that like young with a little bit of a swag to him, But here's what we're asking about it. Is he going to echo MAGA extremes, or is he going to try to carve out a middle ground lane, right? That would be nice if, he could find a balance that, because sometimes you got to be on both sides. Sometimes you got to be on the side that you think is the right way to do it to make everybody better. His business background definitely gives him a lot more of a moderate cred, right? But, it's going to really, time will tell, I guess, on, as his alliances come out, right? What kind of PACs are going to be supporting him? What's the feelings in Kentucky? I mean, that's definitely something to follow, right? Because as people run for office and things like that come up, oh yeah, man, back in 1985, he pooped the wrong way or something. That's just stuff like that just always seems to bubble up. Um, let's kind of shift on to the tariff situation, right? Um, I believe Trump raised the tariffs on India to 50%. Um, that's huge. I believe right now, for the most part, I think outside of China, or I think China's even lower on that right now for the most part. I get where he's coming from on it. I don't disagree with him on it. If you're supporting Russia, I get the money thing, but you could easily sell it to us and we'd buy it too. You're kind of underwriting the funnel of cash for Russia, and you're supposed to be a democracy, so I definitely get the point there. But it's definitely got to be a balancing act. Like, we don't want to drive them into the arms of the Russians and the Chinese, right? And they're already kind of friendlier with them than we would be comfortable with, right? So we definitely got to make sure we don't go too far, right? I mean, I know India does get a lot of its commerce from the United States and a lot of jobs from the United States. So, we can use it as a pressure, but we also need to make sure we have backup plans. But, I think India will come to the table and they can figure something out. I don't think it has to be that, but, especially, with what happens with Trump and Putin at their meeting, be able to go from there. And kind of when you're thinking about like, hey, like a balanced perspective, right? Protectionism generally does help in the short term, but long term, you need fair, stable, like equal trade. Free trade is good with countries from like Europe, industrialized, modernized nations, right? I just don't know if you can have open free trade with nations that have extremely cheap labor. Because how in free trade can you compete with that? You cannot. Like, yes, you do need to get better. That's part of capitalism and market economics, right? You got to get better. You got to get more efficient. But when the gap between what you need for a standard of living in your country and then that other country that's significantly less, like you'd have to have one person doing a job of like 2,000 in order really to make depend. I mean, it's being a little hyperbole there, but You would need that to really make a dent. So, we got to really, really, really watch that and just be close, be a little bit narrower, and just kind of toe the line, I guess, if you want to call it. But just some closing thoughts. In September for the start of football season, my favorite season, get the little gnome back there. Middle Ground Sports is going to be dropping. We're going to cover obviously Detroit sports because that's where I'm from, but we're going to also cover national sports too. So, don't be afraid to check that out. Like I said, Middle Ground Sports. It'll be YouTube and podcast. Still be determined on like how we're going to make all that work. But we are probably going to have a regular guest host on there, another co-host on there as well. Probably I may rotate between a couple people, but so there'll be a lot more back and forth and talking about things, just trying to cut through the coach speak and media speak and things of that nature, right? So don't forget to check that out. And also, don't forget that, I probably hear this all the time. Don't forget to check $1.50 a month for Patreon, right? We're going to be having some really cool stuff in there. There's going to be shorts that are posted ahead of time for big episodes that come out. Uh, there's going to be exclusive content that's only going to be on there. We're going to have some chats with some guests that are coming out. Uh, you know, Join. It's only $1.50. $1.50. That's it. $1.50. You're not even going to notice that. I know times are tough, but hey, $1.50, you're not going to notice that. And you'll find some great content that you're really going to enjoy, especially, if news commentary and things of that nature or something. You're at $1.50 to hear some great stuff that's not all about hate, not all about division. Seems pretty reasonable. Help us keep it going, man. Let's make this a movement. Like, let's push it. But we can't push and make it a movement and take over everything without you guys. I put it out there, and we are exploding in popularity. I mean, like Spotify, I think we're almost at 1,400 followers. Um, which compared to 2 months ago, I think we only had like 100. Not no, I'm not sorry, 110. My apologies. So we are gaining some steam, right? But I need some of you supporters out there on whatever platform you are, man. $1.50, jump on there. Let's get involved. Let's talk about it, right? Or there's some things you disagree with me about? Is there some things maybe I get wrong that maybe I just don't realize it, right? I would like to hear your opinions. Join in the conversation. Let's have some back and forth, man. Let's go. As long as we're polite to each other. We don't need to be jerks. A little sarcasm's okay, but you got to know where the limit is. Let's do that. The world is on fire in more ways than one, from issue at the military base to Gaza, you know, but through everything, this podcast stands for one thing. We believe most Americans want solutions, not political hot air. If you talk to your neighbor, most of them will probably tell you, yeah, we believe in disagreeing without hating each other. Most, and we do believe in the truth. We believe the truth is very rare, far left or far right, because there's generally there's always a little bit like that, that middle ground, right? But and not just about middle ground, not that self promo, but it's like sometimes you can look at both things and there's a little bit of both, right? It's just how life works. So stay with us, speak up, stay in the middle. And this is me, Joe, your host, signing off, reminding you the middle is not the compromise. It's the movement. Have a good day, everybody.